Hello everybody. Thank you for attending this early morning session on coordinated entry. I'm sure it's what you woke up wanting to hear about. I'm really excited about this session. We've been really putting an emphasis on our breakout sessions this year to have questions and answers and a dialogue. You've probably noticed, I forgot to mention this yesterday, you probably noticed the cameras around the room. We have our 360 North crew in the room. Not everybody can make it to our conferences, so we try our best to record them, and we put them up on our website so people can watch these in their own communities, or you can come back and show this session to your local coalition if you want to do that. So in order for that to be a good video experience to watch, if you have a question, if you don't mind just raising your hand, waiting for us to come over with the wireless mic. If you aren't speaking into the mic, the people who are watching this video in the future won't be able to hear you. So we want to make sure that they know what question you asked so they know why we're responding in the way that we are. So this morning's session, we are focusing on coordinated entry. This is a topic that gets a lot of focus over the last year. As I mentioned yesterday, Anchorage has had a coordinated entry system in effect for about a whole year. The balance of state is still in the planning process for their policies and procedures, but we do have that big January 23rd deadline looming around the corner. So just kind of a show of hands, who here is from Anchorage? Who's in the Anchorage community? Who here is from a balance of state community? Okay, good. So this is it's kind of a challenge to do this because we want to make sure that everyone kind of has a good foundation understanding about what coordinated entry is and some of the core elements of it. And then we're going to we're going to start out with Mike Lindsay and Ryan Berger from ICF, who have been really instrumental in our planning process here in the balance of state in terms of getting our coordinated entry system up and running. And then we're going to hear a little bit from our partners at ICA about how the HMIS system helps stand up our coordinated entry system and create those community-wide lists. And then after that, I was kind of hoping we could just do a little bit of an update on where we are in this process, so I'll do that. Christy is here as well from the Anchorage Coalition to answer any questions about the transition they're going through right now in their coordinated entry system. And then we're really encouraging some dialogue and some questions or concerns you might have about this service delivery system. So to start things off, we're going to hear from Mike Lindsay from ICF about the core elements of coordinated entry.
Thanks, Brian. Yep. You guys hear me okay? Okay, well, thanks a lot. Really appreciate you coming out at, like Brian said, 8:30 in the morning for hopefully what will end up being a very informative and at times fun session around coordinated entry. So thanks, folks, for joining. So Brian did a very brief introduction for folks in the room as to who was from the Anchorage Continuum of Care and who was from the Balance of State Continuum of Care. So just by show of hands, and just based on that, I should know this, but just to get a sense of where everyone's understanding is in the room, how many folks are currently operating their programs within a coordinated entry environment? Hopefully that should be a few more folks. We're hoping that everybody in the Anchorage Continuum of Care is actively engaged in working within your coordinated entry system. But for the other folks in the room, how many of you are actively part of the planning process for the coordinated entry system in your Continuum of Care? Great, so we saw a number of hands go up through that process, so thanks for that. I did want to just take a quick show of hands to see how many folks in the room are familiar with the Hearth Act. A couple. How many folks have actually read the Hearth Act or glimpsed over the Hearth Act? Number goes down real quickly when we go from how many know what the Hearth Act is to how many folks have actually read the Hearth Act. But I think I want to boil the entire Hearth Act down to one key sentence that I think really resonates the most for folks in the room and in communities. And it's up on the board, and it is HUD's, the call to action of the Hearth Act really is for programs and communities like yourselves to transform homeless services into crisis response systems that prevent and end homelessness and rapidly return people who experience homelessness to stable housing. One of the key tools that we have to accomplish that vision of the Hearth Act is your coordinated entry systems. Coordinated entry systems are the systems that communities are putting in place to really streamline and coordinate and provide consistency for the way that folks access homeless services within your communities. So it really takes all of you coming together as planners, as program directors, as direct service providers in your community to best understand what services each individual or family that presents for service, what services are the best fit for them, and how can we define a path to get those individuals or families out of their housing crisis or homelessness as quickly and as efficiently as possible. One of the major goals in developing a couple of the major goals in developing a coordinated entry system is to develop a system that everybody in your community has equal access to. Everybody has fair access to. Everybody that presents for service at any access point has a defined way to go through an access process, assessment process, prioritization process, and ultimately a referral process. The goals of coordinated entry are to identify your most vulnerable populations as quickly as possible and to house them as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So we'd like to show this graphic. This really shows graphically, a little bit of narrative, the way homeless services used to be provided in a community and defines the way we're trying to work with communities to redefine homeless response systems to ensure that they are focused on the individual that needs housing services and not focused on the very specific program providing those services. So this is moving away from a first come, first served process. It is moving away from a different assessment process done over here to a different assessment process done over there, and really defining a system that assesses everybody in your community that needs housing services, presents for housing services in a consistent way and consistently defines their vulnerability and the best fit housing option for them. I used to work in the Continuum of Care in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I know for sure that we had permanent supportive housing programs that were housing folks that didn't need that resource. Just because they showed up when there was a vacancy, they showed up at an organization that they knew offered permanent supportive housing, and they were enrolled in a program just because they could be qualified as homeless and have a disability. This is an effort to move away from that and ensure that's not happening in your communities, and the right fit is being identified for each individual or a family that presents for service. So we like to show this graphic here, and this really shows in context what a coordinated entry system can look like in your community. There are a lot of program types in here that I'm sure represent the programs that you operate. How many folks operate transitional housing in your communities? How about emergency housing? Anyone lucky enough to do PSH or rapid rehousing? Great, so we have a nice fit in the room of different housing types. This graphic really starts to show you how all of those different program types and all those different geographies across the street from each other, plane ride away from each other, regardless, shows how all of these different program types can be coordinated in your community to develop a very clear response to ending homelessness in your community. So you kind of see on the left-hand side your coordinated entry system, your entire coordinated entry environment. Everything flows towards the right side of this graphic, ultimately placing folks in some form of permanent housing, whether it's permanent supportive housing, subsidized housing, market rate housing, et cetera. The goal is the same, to move folks who present from service from left to right. What you also see in this graphic is that the paths to get to permanent housing are likely different for a lot of different folks. As you can see on here, we have individuals or families going directly from emergency housing into permanent supportive housing, directly from street outreach services, directly into permanent housing. But then also in the top left-hand corner, you see a couple concepts that may be new to you: prevention and diversion services. The goal of all of our coordinated entry systems should be to divert individuals or families from the homeless response system when they present for service. If there's a safe place for them to go, a better option than your homeless system, we want to interact with those individuals and families and see if they can be diverted and or prevented from ever entering your homeless response system. So the first question we get when we start to work in communities is, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? What's in it for the continuum of care? What's in it for the clients that present for services? I want to focus on that last one first. What's in it for the clients that present for services in a old historic homeless system versus a coordinated entry system? historically, if I needed services in a community, I would go to where I thought services were provided. And I'd go and I'd be assessed, and if they had an opening that fit my characteristics, I may be housed. If they didn't, I'd go down the street to another emergency housing provider, or I'd go to where I thought there might be transitional housing available. And if I was lucky enough, I'd connect with a case manager that could say, XYZ program down the street has a permanent supportive housing opening that you may fit into. This eliminates that process, should eliminate that process where an individual has to hop around your community looking for services, and it should very clearly define how they access services, where they access services, and our goal is to ensure that the most vulnerable populations that access services in that defined way are prioritized for services as quickly as possible. A couple other points I want to point out on here. So that's what's in it for us as, or for clients, or participants of programs attempting to access services. But for your continuum of care, it gives your continuum of care a much better sense of what your homeless response system needs and how it operates today. So if you need more rapid rehousing, based on what your data of your coordinated entry system shows you, this should give your continuum the ability to leverage other services, reallocate other services, or put services in areas where there currently aren't effective or efficient services available. So we don't have enough time to go through all of these, but I know these slides will be made available. There are certainly some key talking points in here that you can use within your communities as you talk about coordinated entry, but specifically with your funders as well. We're seeing a lot of communities make a lot of progress with their local foundation communities around coordinated entry, starting to build that as a requirement, not only for your COC and your ESG funded programs, but also your private foundation programs as well. Good. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about what are the core components of a coordinated entry system. How do we take this concept of prioritization, this concept of consistent assessments and access models? How do we take that and actually implement that in a community? And what is the requirement that is placed on each COC to develop a coordinated entry system? So with that, I am going to pass it over to Ryan.
Great. Thanks very much, Mike. So just to dive in a little bit more specifically to the process itself. So just to differentiate sort of the two flow charts that we see here. This one is really representing the process, including your project types. So the available programs, housing resources you might have in your community, again, representing likely what you have in your community, whether it's Anchorage, whether it's Fairbanks, whether it's Nome, or other villages as well. We might have some combination of shelter, maybe some transitional housing, maybe some sort of permanent housing resource at the end as well. This is really showing what HUD's intent of a coordinated entry process would look like, and this can really be thought of regardless of what types of housing programs and services you might have in your community. So I think, when we think about how services used to be provided prior to coordinated entry, we might see something like access, so a household or an individual presenting for service, maybe some sort of assessment primarily geared towards eligibility, not really thinking about vulnerability, not really thinking about severity of service needs or chronic homeless status, things like that. It would really be, do I have a bed and are you eligible for my program? So a very simplified workflow. I think what coordinated entry is really doing is trying to collect additional information to help a household, to help a potential client make the best and most informed and most appropriate decision at any specific point in time through the coordinated entry process, regardless of where that might be. So we see here, sort of moving left to right, access points. It could be a physical site, it could be a virtual site, it could be your 211 hotline is something that would, a lot of communities statewide and balance of state and large rural communities are looking at. It could be your street outreach programs as well, so sort of proactively engaging folks. So really thinking of access to the system and to the coordinated entry process in a couple of different ways. Assessment is really an ongoing phase, again, sort of collecting the minimum amount of necessary information from a client, from a potential program participant, to help them make the most informed decision at a point in time. Then we have the new concept, new notion of prioritization. And this is really the biggest paradigm shift that coordinated entry is introducing in communities. So this is something where, again, in the past, communities have historically provided services primarily on a first-come, first-served basis. Given the scarcity of resources, given the lack of funding, given the need to serve those who are most vulnerable, the notion of prioritization becomes a really, really important concept. And then finally, we have the referral process. So this could be to a shelter. It could be, ideally to a rapid rehousing or permanent housing resource. It could even be to something like market rate housing, subsidized housing, tax credit, Section 8 properties as well. It could be to other systems of care like the VA, really based on the availability and appropriateness of those resources as well. So to dig in a little more specifically to the requirements of coordinated entry. So back in January, HUD released their notice establishing additional requirements on coordinated entry. Coordinated entry has actually been a requirement of the COC program since 2012. So it's mentioned in the COC program interim rule. Again, the Hearth Act is really calling for a change in moving from programs to systems level thinking. But the notice itself establishing the specific requirements is about 9 or 10 months old at this point. So as we think ahead towards Brian's birthday, I believe in addition to that and the point in time count, January 23rd is also the date of compliance for your coordinated entry systems, to have your policies and procedures developed, to have your COC and ESG funded programs participating. So we're looking forward to January 23rd. I'm sure Brian and the folks in the room are as well. So we want to break down the requirements to sort of 4 specific details, and they were represented on the previous slide: access, assessment, prioritization, and referral. So at a high level, some of the requirements of access points is that they have to offer a standardized decision-making process. So it's not based on whether I look like a pleasant person. It's not based on whether or not I know the case manager. It's not based on whether or not a host of other factors are at play. This is really requiring all access points, regardless of where they are, regardless of what they look like, to offer the same standardized approach to folks either being assessed or being referred or being screened and potentially diverted as well. The fair and equal access is really an important consideration. We want to make sure that just because you are homeless in Juneau, you don't have a different pathway into the system as you would if you were homeless in Fairbanks or Nome or Bethel or wherever you might be. The coordinated entry system must be accessible across the COC's geographic area. We work in a lot of balance of state and statewide continuums like Idaho, Colorado, Arizona, others in the lower 48. Nothing quite looks like Alaska, clearly. But this is really something where a virtual or phone-based hotline approach to access might make a lot of sense for a large rural geography such as Alaska. Again, this is really making sure that just because you are homeless in a place within the continuum or within the state doesn't mean you have a different screening approach, doesn't mean you have a different pathway or assessment process either into or out of the homeless response system. If it makes sense and if the resources are available, HUD also permits communities to establish separate access points for the types of households you see here. So you don't see things like a specific access point for people with substance abuse disorders. You don't see specific access points for veterans. So these are things that just because they're a type of person or a type of household with a certain characteristic, those things aren't actually permissible in a coordinated entry process. So the 5 types of separate access points can be established. This isn't to say if I'm a single individual and I present at a family access point that I'm turned away and that's the end of it. This means that there's something like a warm handoff, there's coordination through a case conferencing process. We want to make sure that communities are, again, coordinating and collaborating through this systems level approach to make sure that people are engaged and referred in the most appropriate manner. Again, we touched on street outreach. If you have either a COC or ESG funded street outreach program, something like the PATH program, even street outreach through the VA or private and faith-based opportunities, is a really, really effective way to, again, proactively engage those who are most likely, the longest, those who are experiencing homelessness for the longest period of time and might have been resistant to engagement in the past. Again, the assessment sort of requirement, the assessment considerations, this is something that really would be ongoing throughout the entire length of time that a person or a family is engaged in the process. So again, there's the principle of only collecting the minimum amount of information necessary to make that client, help assist that client, make the most informed and most appropriate decision at any specific point in time. So it might be something as short as a 5 or 6 question survey to determine what their immediate crisis needs are, their vulnerability, their severity of service needs, their risks of continued homelessness, and determine, is shelter appropriate? Is there a permanent housing resource that's available? Can we divert you from the system? And we can see sort of the progressive engagement approach to collecting information, really leading up to a comprehensive assessment, which would likely happen once the client is enrolled in a program. You're developing a case plan, case management plan, housing goal plan, et cetera. So again, this is really where the notion of prioritization starts to come into play. You're collecting information, again, partially based on eligibility, but more importantly based on severity of service needs and helping that client or household make the most informed decision as possible. So with regard to prioritization, again, this is something that Anchorage has been working on for several months. This is something that the Balance of State is still planning and developing as well. This is really the biggest systems level change that communities are undergoing. So again, coordinated entry, at least to start, isn't bringing new resources to the table. It provides a forum for people and resources and stakeholders and partners to get engaged, but it's not going to magically create new rapid rehousing or permanent housing opportunities. This is really designed to help communities determine what their local priorities are and who they want to target with the scarce resources that are available. So going back to 2014 and then again last year, HUD has released prioritization notices specifically targeted at permanent supportive housing. And if we read those notices, we can see that HUD is really asking communities, and if you adopt the notice, then you're required to prioritize your permanent supportive housing resources based on primarily 2 factors: the length of time a program participant has been homeless and their severity of service needs. And severity of service needs is sort of a loosely defined concept. Communities can come at this from different angles based on the types of information that might be available. Your standardized assessment, so Anchorage has adopted the VI-SPDAT, which is your vulnerability index. I believe that the Balance of State has done the same. Things like standardized assessment tools are really, really important to help determine, to Mike's earlier point, if permanent supportive housing is in fact the most appropriate resource based on your length of time homeless and your vulnerability. We want to make sure that these scarce, long-term, high-cost resources aren't being used to serve people who might be more appropriate for a rapid rehousing, a lower cost, shorter term project. So this is a really, really important point and a really, really important requirement to help communities make the best decisions as possible and use their resources as effectively as possible. You can, in addition to the VI-SPDAT or other types of standardized assessment tools, you can also look at other factors like the frequency of somebody's interaction with crisis response systems. Are they being discharged from institutions and were previously homeless? Are they unsheltered? Are they at high risk of victimization or trafficking or other types of exploitation? So you can consider a lot of different sort of variables when you're thinking about how you want to determine a prioritization approach or priority status. But again, this is really something where a standardized decision-making process is really, really important to make sure that, again, just because I'm homeless in Juneau, I'm not number 1, whereas if I were homeless in Fairbanks, I might be number 10 in line for services. So it's a really, again, a paradigm shift and a really important approach when we're talking about systems level thinking. So to wrap up the considerations and some of the requirements from the coordinated entry notice, we wanted to talk briefly about referrals. Again, this participation in a coordinated entry system is required for anybody who's receiving COC and ESG program funding. It's highly, highly encouraged for other types of stakeholders, other types of service providers, your public housing authorities, your regional housing coalitions, your local VAMCs, behavioral health providers. It's really important to have these stakeholders at the table, both during the planning process, but also as services are being delivered and your coordinated entry system is being launched. HMIS and case conferencing is a really, really important tool. So as Kim and Alyssa start to talk about the role of HMIS, it's really important to think about how it's being used, either currently in Anchorage or about to be used in the balance of state, and how else it can be used as a tool to support all elements of the coordinated entry system. Things like safety planning and documenting referrals if they happen to be rejected or denied by a provider are really, really important, both for quality improvement of your coordinated entry system, but also to make sure that the system itself and participating providers are operating in a standardized, transparent, and accountable manner. And of course, client choice, things like Housing First are absolutely crucial to be developed and included in the coordinated entry system. Clients aren't necessarily placed, they are referred, right? And feels like a minor distinction when we're talking about it just with words, but it's really, really important when we see it put into practice. So just to wrap up quickly, these are some of the elements of a successful coordinated entry system. It would be streamlined, it's consumer focused, it's accountable and standardized, it's inclusive, not just of your COC and ESG program funded providers, but other systems of care, other stakeholders and service providers as well. And the use of data to both determine what gaps you might have in your system that you may have thought you knew about, but coordinated entry actually gives you the data to determine where your gaps are and what's needed to fill those gaps. And again, it's a really, really important tool and mechanism to show the success that you're making in terms of preventing and ending homelessness and bringing additional funders and stakeholders to the table to help support the coordinated entry process at your community level. A couple quick resources. Again, these slides will be available, but there's a self-assessment checklist, quick and easy tool to go through just to see where you're at as a community, as a continuum, with regard to attaining compliance by Brian's birthday. The Coordinated Entry Guidebook is a really, really helpful resource. This is available on the HUD Exchange. It's a pretty lengthy document, but there's a lot of helpful descriptions and sort of charts and workflows, and a lot of information for rural communities too, which isn't necessarily something that HUD has targeted in the past. So the guidebook is a really great resource. And then just about a month ago, HUD also released a toolkit of community samples, so we can see what other balance of states are doing. We can see what other communities are doing with their policies and procedures, with their prioritization approaches, with their use of HMIS. So if you haven't seen these resources, please check them out. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kim and Alyssa.
Good morning. My name is Alyssa Parrish, and I am the Alaska Project Manager with the Institute for Community Alliances. I see a lot of familiar faces this morning. That's great. I also have Kim Seitz with me. She is also with ICA, and she is in our Anchorage office. So we're going to talk kind of at a 30-foot level about how HMIS supports the coordinated entry process. And we'll get into a couple slides toward the end that talk specifically about how we've been involved in the Anchorage process of coordinated entry. So the topics that Brian tasked us to talk about this morning are how HMIS supports coordinated entry, the balance of state data sharing in HMIS, because that's looking at some changes fairly soon here, why data sharing in HMIS is beneficial, even for those small communities like Ketchikan or Hoonah or Petersburg who only have one provider, HMIS and case conferencing for coordinated entry, ICA, so our role in the coordinated entry process, and then DV providers and coordinated entry. So how HMIS supports coordinated entry, we have been increasing the capacity of utilization of AK HMIS since we started in June of 2015, and that's been really important just in and of itself, but also as we have prepared for coordinated entry to come online in Anchorage and the balance of state, building that capacity and having as many providers as it makes sense to use HMIS, entering in that client level data really builds up and supports the coordinated entry process. It makes sense to use HMIS if you're a provider that serves clients who are experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness, regardless of the funding that you receive. And then obviously a robust HMIS supports coordinated entry by having as full of a picture, a complete picture of homelessness in your community as possible. So currently ICA is in 11 different states now, and we're supporting over 30 COCs in their coordinated entry process. Each one of these COCs is at a different place in coordinated entry, and at each step along the way and within each COC, ICA is supporting them by using their HMIS in the CE planning and implementation processes. So balanced estate data sharing, just like Anchorage data sharing, has all of these advantages in doing this. So coordinating client care, increasing effectiveness of referrals, sharing assessment results, determining prioritization, reducing duplicate client records, linking clients to appropriate services. And there does need to be a clear purpose for sharing that data within HMIS. So obviously there's documentation, there are releases of information that go along with sharing that data within the system. Currently in the balance of state, so the balance of state covers a huge amount of geography, right? And so we're dealing with Juneau, with the Mat-Su Valley, with Kenai, with Fairbanks, with Bethel, with Nome, with Kotzebue, with the Southeast. All of those providers are lumped into this balance of state COC. And right now we have Juneau providers sharing with Juneau providers. And we have Mat-Su Valley providers sharing with Mat-Su Valley providers. And we have, there's another one. Well, Fairbanks is coming online with sharing with Fairbanks providers. And while this community level data sharing in HMIS is really helpful at the community level, in order for the COC balance of state coordinated entry process to really support the clients fully, we need to get onto this balance of statewide data sharing. And so what we want to see happen is for a client who presents at a provider in Juneau to have their ROI presented to them in a way that they sign to agree to share with a provider in Fairbanks or in the Mat-Su Valley. And this forms a more complete picture of clients. Hold on.
Questions are encouraged.
Yes, please.
I just don't know how to turn on the microphones, so I'm gonna.
Well, I'll just talk loud.
Hello. Oh, it is
Thank
on.
you. Sorry. So my question is, are you planning on ultimately having statewide sharing with Anchorage as well? Because you mentioned just the COC.
System-wide. So HMIS is a statewide implementation, right? So Anchorage providers, balance of state providers, whether you're in Juneau or the Valley or Fairbanks or Anchorage, they're all entering data into a single HMIS database. So it's online, it's one URL. My goal, it's been my 5-year plan, so I have 5-year plans, I have 2-year plans. My 5-year plan is to get statewide HMIS system-wide data sharing online. I think that that's a larger conversation. I think there's a lot of things that need to happen for that to happen. But yes, I think that's an ultimate goal. Because there's not walls, right? So Anchorage there's no wall cutting off Mat-Su Valley from Anchorage, from Juneau, from Fairbanks. And we have seen in the data sets that we have that for however it happens, there's a lot of transiency within this state. So you have clients who may have been served in Juneau during one point in time that you see next year is down up in Fairbanks, is over in the Valley. I mean, it happens. I don't know how, but it does.
And is this one on? Can you guys hear me? Okay, there we go. And this is actually probably one of the biggest challenges I think that we're facing right now. And I was going to speak to this a little bit more, is the system, how it's set up right now, is not really to the benefit of the client. We do see a lot of migration, even between communities that aren't connected by roads whatsoever, which is why it wasn't too difficult to actually go to the local coalitions and get them to buy off on this COC-wide data sharing. I think the good work that ICA has done to kind of raise awareness about what our HMIS system is and what it can accomplish for our clients has helped this process. And even now, I get calls all the time that from either Anchorage agencies or from Balance of State agencies that say, hey, I have a client here, he has family in Anchorage. He's kind of just stuck in Juneau. How do I get his information over? And literally, like right now, if he was assessed with a VI SPDAT in Juneau, that information can't be passed along to Anchorage. I mean, even just with our ROIs, how it's set up. But there is already, though, some data sharing that's happening from the Balance of State to Anchorage. For example, in Mat-Su Valley, Catholic Social Services is on their regionalized data sharing system. So it's going to be a little bit of a change, but definitely a conversation that's on our priority list for early 2018 when our two COC boards meet and discuss the future of our HMIS system. So I think you could probably expect this to happen in the coming months. I hope.
And ultimately, I think that statewide data sharing would be more client-centered, because right now, the entity that is sharing in both the Mat-Su Valley and Anchorage requires that the client sign a Mat-Su Valley ROI and then an Anchorage ROI. So they're signing two different ROIs to share their data in a single system, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. And with a client who's in crisis, it's really difficult to explain that and really have truly informed consent. I did go back to this slide just because I kind of blew through it. That really shows the benefits of sharing data within HMIS. So it's not just making it easier for the agency, it does make it easier for the client as well. And Brian kind of touched on this, but even in small communities like Ketchikan and like Barrow and Bethel and even Nome, I actually just anecdotally ran into a client record the other day that had services in Nome and Anchorage. So there is a lot of movement within the system itself, but right now those clients, you have a client record that's created in Nome and a client record that's created in Anchorage, and right now those two client records aren't talking to each other. I mean, we can see that it's the same record, but Nome can only see the Nome record and Anchorage can only see the Anchorage record. And that's not really helping the client because it's not looking at the entire picture of the client's homelessness history over time. So that's why getting entities in Ketchikan that may only have 3 or 4 entities, or in Petersburg where they only have 1 right now, or in Hoonah or Bethel or Nome, to get onto the data sharing really helps them, because if they're serving a client who came to them from somewhere else, they may not necessarily have to start from scratch because that client has been served across the state and there's already a partial picture created about that client in the system. Go for it.
No, Alyssa, I was just going to basically say what you just said when you back a slide when you had said that it's data sharing is client focused, and you're absolutely right, and it makes it easier for the client, but it also makes it easier for the users putting data in based on what you just said, because you're not having to duplicate information, just update information. So it makes it easy all the way around.
Right, which also means that the client isn't necessarily telling you their story over and over and over again. If you already have a base set of information that hasn't changed, like their name and their date of birth and that stuff, you're not having to spend the time and they're not having to repeat themselves over and over and over again.
Is it true that the HMIS system is just for 18 and over?
No. So the data sharing, okay, so I think there's a distinction to be made between entering data into HMIS and sharing data in HMIS. So HMIS can be used for any client that is served by a provider that is providing services to clients experiencing or at risk of homelessness. So it can be households, families with children, single individuals, unaccompanied youth, the whole gamut. And prior to 2016, the way that AKHMIS was set up was that you were completely closed off from each other. So Anchorage providers were entering data into HMIS, but an Anchorage provider wasn't sharing data with another Anchorage provider in the system. So the data was completely siloed off even within the same community prior to 2016. So in 2016, we started these community level data sharing agreements, right? So Anchorage providers can share data within Anchorage, and Matsu providers can share data within Matsu, and Juneau can share information within Juneau. With the exception of these unaccompanied youth providers, they can sign. So an unaccompanied youth who is under the age of 18 cannot sign an ROI because it's a legal document. However, if they have a guardian or parent who can sign on their behalf to share their data in HMIS, they can share that data, but we understand that that's likely not going to happen because usually the providers that are entering data into HMIS for unaccompanied youth are runaway and homelessness providers, right? So it's highly unlikely that they're gonna get a signed ROI for that client. That doesn't mean that you don't enter that data into HMIS for that youth. It just means that you're not sharing it in the system with other providers that enter data into the system. So there's a good distinction to make there, and I'm glad you brought that up. And then households, families that are served, the guardian or legal guardian of the children within a household can sign an ROI on those children's behalf to share their data in HMIS. Other questions? So if not, I'm going to have Kim come up and talk about kind of our role in the case conferencing and Anchorage coordinated entry process since they started in January.
Hi, everyone. As she said, I'm Kim. I work in the Anchorage office as a system administrator. I started 1 year ago today, so happy anniversary to me. Yeah, so that's me. I did grow up here in Fairbanks, so I've been in the state for a while. As far as coordinated entry and case conferencing goes, from ICA's perspective, we have been involved in the process, well, since before Zach and I came online, but since Zach and I came online, we've been going to all of the coordinated entry meetings. In Anchorage, there's 3 different tracks. So there's an adult singles, families, and youth track. The meetings for youth and families didn't come online until after the new year, but we've been attending the adult singles one since October-ish of last year. Our role in those meetings has changed over the time of coordinated entry because of providers being more comfortable with the system, because of the way that the process has just changed for the community of Anchorage. When we first were there, we spent a lot of time looking up individual clients and finding out information that was needed to kind of figure out where they were on the list, why they were at where they were on the list, who entered the information, how will we go back and find them. At this point in time, we do a lot more listening. The providers really know what they're doing. They know who they're talking about. They know who put that information on the list, which access point the client went to get put on the list. And so every once in a while, people will ask us a question. They'll want to know how we, who put them on the list because a provider's not there that day, or they want to know their contact information, things like that, just real quick stuff that we'll look up. In general, what's in the system for case conferencing is their placement on the list. So they go through an intake, all that information is entered into HMIS because it's the shared system. And then we can prioritize based on their length of time homeless, based on their vulnerability score. And then from there, the providers will all conference, 1, whether that score is accurate, 2, do they have all the documentation in place so that when a housing placement becomes open, they can be referred and move through that process quickly. Laura works with an SRA provider, and she has to have specific documentation in place. And if they have that documentation before they get referred to her provider, her process is easier. Her process is faster. It gets them into housing faster. And so we just kind of support case conferencing wherever it's needed. I guess that was kind of our role as well. But to kind of further expand upon that, beyond the case conferencing meetings, our role is kind of whatever you need our role to be. We build the assessments in HMIS. We build the reports in HMIS. If there is an error on a report, we can change that. If there's an error in an assessment, we can change that. If data isn't shared appropriately, we'll support with that. If people aren't sure why this person's on the list 3 different times under 3 different client ID numbers, we'll assist with that. We're cheerleaders. We hurrah, hurrah, everybody along. We really just want to see people getting into housing as quickly as possible. So whatever you need us to be is what we are in that moment. And then for DV agencies, they are prohibited from entering into a shared system, which means they cannot enter into the Alaska HMIS because it is shared across different communities and it's used by all agencies in the state. They can and should and are required to enter into a comparable database, but that's not something that we can pull into any prioritization list. If they get COC and or ESG funding, they are required to be part of coordinated entry as well. And so they should be included in case conferencing because then they can say, hey, we have a client, this is their score on the VI SPDAT, this is how long they've been homeless, so according to your prioritization list, they'd fall, 3rd or whatever. And so when that 3rd housing placement comes open, they can be pushed into that spot. So we really encourage DV agencies to be included in the process, to be at the case conferencing meetings, and to share not the specifics of their clients because that's not allowed, but like where their clients would fall compared to the other people that are being shared within HMIS. Did I miss anything? Okay. Questions?
I'll be there on
She's coming.
So this question is for kind of any of you esteemed individuals up there at the tables. Is there a specific coordinated entry strategy for sex offenders in Alaska that we should be aware of? Because it seems like there's a lot of barriers to housing in our communities.
As it stands in Anchorage, we do not collect any information, I believe, on their sex offender status, but when they are referred to certain housing opportunities, if sex offense is a barrier to entry to that project, then unfortunately they get kicked back to the list. I think Christy works a little more closely with the specific referrals and could speak to how it's working in Anchorage.
Christy, why don't you come on?
But as it stands right now, I think there are options in Anchorage where sex offense is not a barrier to entry into the project.
And I also just looked at the Iowa Balance of State coordinated entry assessment kind of in preparation for this. And they do have a specific question that asks about your sex offender status, knowing that that is a huge barrier to some housing projects that are participating in coordinated entry.
Yeah, when you're talking about case conferencing and people putting data into the system, what I'm thinking about, are behavioral health providers involved in that process? Because I don't see very many behavioral health providers entering into HMIS. It's mostly housing providers. So how do we know as housing providers the most vulnerable of the population if they're being treated by behavioral health providers? Does that make sense? The case managers that may not be entering into HMIS, are they being included and recruited for that process so they're part of that assessment process? Because I think that's a missing link. And also those with public safety, DOC, that also deal with that chronically homeless population, are they involved with that case management, vulnerability list surveying, referral, assessment, all that kind of stuff?
Hey, Miko, can you turn my mic on here?
I can't hear you, Brian.
Test. All right. No, they should be. Absolutely. I'm really excited about coordinated entry. I know it's a huge change. I know it's forcing some very difficult conversations and really taking a hard look at how we are delivering services to our most vulnerable. But I can speak, so while the Balance of State is still in the planning process, there are some communities that are really ahead of the curve. Because of the Juneau Housing First facility that just opened, they kind of had to jump into this coordinated entry process before the PMPs were finalized by the COC board. And so they were like, okay, we have to create a community-wide list, and they spent a month finding every individual they could and administering a VI SPDAT. And they knew that in order to have an accurate list, they had to really reach out to all of the stakeholders in the community that work with this population. And so they reached out to Rainforest Recovery Center. They reached out to the hospital, and then obviously the street outreach and the agencies. And so these were, kind of a diverse group of people that have never really sat at the table at one time to say, how do we fix this problem and how do we prioritize our community, our clients. And it was a beautiful thing. Not often do you have 32 units that you get to fill, and help their situation. But they brought everybody to the table. They got, behavioral health, their hospitals and their agencies all on a shared release information to share this information that they had. And they created their list and they sat down, and wouldn't you know it, the number one person on the list ended up not even receiving one of those units that they just had. If that diverse group wasn't in the room, that individual probably would have continued to fall through the cracks. But because of the information that they could share, and the reason why that person didn't get a voucher is because there was like a history of arson with that individual. That's a client that's been in Juneau for a long time that hasn't really been served at all. And they were able to sit around in case conference, and while this individual kind of fell through the cracks and couldn't qualify for any of the housing opportunities they were able to get creative. And this agency gave a little here, this agency gave a little here. They were able to place this person in a living situation that was appropriate, but they needed additional wraparound services. And it was a beautiful thing, They, instead of housing 32, they ended up housing 33 because of this process that was in place. And that's really what we're hoping, that this new way of prioritizing services in your community will come. But it's really, we are asking as a COC for the local coalitions to be aggressive in reaching out to these agencies that typically aren't in the housing discussion, because in order to have a successful placement, you need to have those wraparound services available as well. So kind of a long ways to answer your question, but just a real big positive that we saw come out of the Juneau process.
Brian, can I just add a couple real quick points
Sure,
to
Mike.
that, to the question that was asked in the past? How do you as a community really start to think about vulnerability when you only have access to certain data sets? I think that really is the challenge that you have upon you as a community. Your COC should be thinking about your philosophy for your HMIS system, as well as the philosophy of your coordinated entry system, really thinking outside of the box and outside of the realm of just simply your homeless providers. So when you're thinking about HMIS, the core requirement is to have all of your COC, ESG, some veterans, PATH programs on your HMIS systems. Where we're seeing communities really have an impact through the use of their data, they're expanding their HMIS vision out to their mental health providers, their drug and alcohol providers, their local housing authorities, anybody that works within a community providing some level of potential service to a homeless individual or a family. Once we start to see that participation in your HMIS system expand out from there, then you as a community can go back to some of the points that Ryan made at the beginning, really thinking about what prioritization and vulnerability means in your community. A lot of communities are using tools like the VI SPDAT to do their assessment triage and to assess vulnerability. But we would really encourage you as a community to think more holistically about how an individual or family interacts in your community, to think about their vulnerability. It's up to you as a community to think about their mental health. If they've accessed mental health services, if they've accessed child welfare services, CYF services in your community, drug and alcohol services, you have the ability to define vulnerability the way it makes the most sense in your community. It's tough to do while you're still building your HMIS system and expanding it out, but it certainly makes sense to have that larger vision in mind, John, and to ensure that those are the conversations, follow up on Brian's point, that you're having at your COC leadership tables.
So as far as sharing the data within our communities, how can that happen? Is it up to us? Say I have 24 clients and I want to share their data with our local mental health or our homeless or our rescue mission. I mean, is that up to us, or is that something that's still in the process? Because I know we were able to share some data during the homeless count. Fairbanks. Yeah.
I think it starts at the agency level. So you're saying, I think it makes sense for me to share my data in HMIS with the larger community. And so that decision is made at an agency level, and then each individual client signs a client consent to share and release of information to share their individual client record in HMIS.
Okay.
So it's a two-step decision, right? So the agency agrees that they are willing to do so, and then the client agrees that they're willing to do so.
Okay, and then my second part of my question, so if I were to share information with the consent and everything with another agency, and then if they were to enter information on that same client that they served, then I would be able to access that information. The client wouldn't have to sign another ROI with the other agency.
So that depends on the community in which you work.
Okay.
So there are communities in which an ROI signed at one agency allows data sharing to go all over. So client signs at, say, Catholic Social Services, then they go to NeighborWorks, and they don't have to sign another ROI at NeighborWorks for NeighborWorks to share that data back.
Okay.
But there are other communities where that's not the case. And so client is seen at Valley Charities. They sign an ROI for Valley Charities to enter their data in and share it. But then they go to Valley Residential Services, and Valley Residential Services has them sign basically the same ROI, saying that they're agreeing to share their data back.
Okay.
Because the data sharing it doesn't have to be a two-way street.
Right.
So like Fairbanks Youth Advocates can see data that is being shared with them, but they don't have to share it back because they can't.
Right.
So it depends on where you're working.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any other questions in the room right now? I just want to make sure that we're giving time for that. I just really wanted to mention that, you know, a big benefit of this is, and the reason why we haven't rolled out our policies and procedures in the balance of state is, you know, we are purposely wanting to take time. This process, more than any other process, has been really a conduit for communities who never talk to each other about how their statewide system works to do so. You know, when we first read the HUD notice, you know, given the timeline, we were thinking, you know, how can we do this? And believe me, it'd be really easy for me to just draft up some PMPs and run it through the board and get it passed. But that would just probably lead to a whole host of errors that we didn't consider because there are quite a few regional differences. And so we formed a design team, a coordinated entry design team that Mike and Ryan from ICF are helping facilitate along with Carrie Collins from AHFC and myself. And we've been meeting on a regular basis asking these hard questions. You know, for this type of housing intervention, what target population should be prioritized for it? What makes the most sense? And then among the individuals in that target population, what are the prioritization factors that we want to focus on? And we actually did a ranking list and compared community to community, and it was really fascinating to see the differences. And so that type of information is really informing what our statewide policies and procedures are going to end up being. We're playing this delicate balanced game of, you know, being firm on how we want the system to operate and who should be receiving services, what prioritization factors we should have, but also allowing for those regional differences to happen, and allowing for different regions to have their own set of policies and procedures that reflect their community need as well. The last thing we want to do is stand up 5 different coordinated entry systems in the state. That's not really client focused. But at the same time, you know, the Mat-Su Valley, for example, this is a community that's so close to Anchorage, it doesn't make sense for them to stand up an entire system in themselves, you know, but it does make sense for them to integrate with Anchorage services, more so than it would for a community like Fairbanks that's, you know, very isolated, doesn't have a whole lot of duplication of services in their community to do so. Mike, did you want to speak to that?
Actually, we had a comment and question in the back that I thought maybe Brian and Christy could both respond to. So
Yeah.
John had brought up, can we go back and talk about the referral and denial concept? I mean, ultimately, the goal of a coordinated entry system is to ensure that all openings in your homeless response system are filled through a direct referral from your coordinated entry system. So a common access model, common assessment model, prioritization, and then ultimately a referral to a homeless provider. But I think John's question was, or maybe to rephrase John's question, can you both talk about the expectations for homeless providers in both of your continuums for COC, ESG funded programs, how they're expected to interact with your coordinated entry systems from the referral perspective?
Yeah. You want to hit that one?
Okay, it's on. So in Anchorage, anyone who receives COC money, ESG money, and also SSVF participate in coordinated entry, and they are required to accept those referrals and work on the housing placements. But we're really fortunate in that providers that don't necessarily receive these funds still participate on BHAP funds as well. They all participate and are required to in coordinated entry. But we have providers that go above and beyond and participate through the referral process and help with housing, even though they may not be the recipient of these funds. And the understanding, I will say that coordinated entry was rolled out in January, and we are learning a lot of lessons still and better defining what that program is locally. I actually really like to hear that Brian and Balance of State are very deliberative in the PNP development, because we went through one. I know Carrie from AHFC reviewed it, ICF did, ICA. We had tons of involvement for our PMPs. We rolled them out, and then HUD rolled out the Notice 1701 that had tons more requirements that we were supposed to do, and now we're cleaning those up and making policies that better serve our clients. But there's still the understanding that whoever receives those funds, they participate in our case conferencing meetings, depending on the population that they best serve or have services for. And when we have clients that come up on the prioritization list that fit the next open housing availability, we make those referrals and start facilitating the process so they can be placed. I do, though, have a couple things, maybe, and this is getting off the subject. Someone asked about what do you do with barriers with sex offenders. So coordinated entry is designed to remove those barriers so anyone can enroll in the program and be eligible for housing services. If they come up next on the list and we refer them to a specific program and their criminal history prevents them from being placed, generally it's arson and sex offense, then we have to find an alternate housing placement or try to help find landlords who are more flexible with those sort of histories. But we don't collect their criminal history, and we can't prevent them from enrolling in coordinated entry because of those charges against them.
Yeah, so in other words, the coordinated entry system isn't replacing your own agency's intake requirements. It's not replacing your own intake forms that you have. The VI-SPDAT isn't changing that. It's simply a triage referral mechanism. But what's great about it is that, as Christy said, if that referral is made and that doesn't work out, that individual isn't just, lost. The case conferencing component of it brings a community together to get creative and really address those hard to house individuals. We have about 1 more minute, so a really quick question.
Okay, so this isn't going to be a quick question, but I'll try. Okay, so I would think that this is going to be something that's going to be dealing with rural areas, probably more so than the urban side of things. If you have agencies that there's only, say, 3 for the size of the Kenai Peninsula that are actually entering into HMIS, that means that all of the other agencies that deal with people that are vulnerable and near homelessness aren't seeing any data, aren't putting in any data. When they come to the table and they're talking about coordinated entry with the case conferencing, have you guys seen a way that there's been an assessment process that's been done prior to that allowed them to come to the table? So I guess this is more for an Anchorage question to see if, even though it doesn't really qualify since it's not urban, when you have fewer people that are entering in data, but you have a bigger table of people that see the individuals, how do you get that assessment tool out to all of the agencies that don't enter in data? How did that process work? Have you seen anything that way? Or if you haven't, is there a way to address that?
I think I'm following, and if I'm not, I'll do my best to clarify. So we have multiple providers that participate in all of our case conferencing meetings. There are providers that collect that information and enter it into HMIS, and there's others, they don't access the system, but they still have agreements to case conference and share that client confidential data, whether it's verbally like we're sitting here or they physically look at the database and enter information into HMIS. So you have the flexibility and opportunity to do that the way we have in Anchorage, and ICA has structured it in a way. We have a list of everyone who participates, whether they enter data or they just come to meetings that's available on their website. So clients know who's participating in that. I would recommend, as you're setting up your access points, to keep them really tight and not go too far out in the community, because it's very helpful to have a lot of providers involved, but the more you do, the more you are going to run into data errors or data incompleteness. So if you want non-HMIS users to maybe do your assessments on paper and then have someone else enter it, you'd have to work that out with ICA, and that's what's the name of the agreement when you do that? Like a third party enters data for you? A coordinated services agreement, you can do that as well. I'm not sure I'm totally answering your question, but we have plenty of providers that use HMIS and plenty who do not, and they're all a part of that confidentiality agreement to share the information and place clients into housing and other supportive services.
And to add
one thing to that, there is a provider, the VA does not have access to HMIS as it currently stands, but they do a lot of outreach, and so we want them to be able to be somebody who is actively putting people on the list, and so they're filling out paper packets and handing them off to somebody who can do that entry. So there are people right now that are doing paper packets. They don't have to have access to HMIS in order to fill that out, get the information, do the assessment for the client, and then get them on the list through other means. So it is happening.
So, in the interest of time here, I'm the conference planner here, so I got to make sure everything's on time. We do have to wrap this session up, but it's kind of perfect timing because in the next session, it's a state and federal partner listening and discussion session. So any of these questions are applicable there. We're going to have folks not only from our COC and AHFC, VA, but also Diane Yantel and staff from our federal delegation here to answer questions and hear from you. So I do encourage you to stick around and please participate in that. That's going to be really about you guys and hearing from you what your comments, concerns, or questions might be. So thank you very much. Yeah.